I'll go back to this later on. So, okay, so if you look at this chart, basically this is trying to see the role of the savings rate. And the logic is the following. You know, if you try to ask the question whether exchange rate affects growth, you have to include other variables in your equation which you believe will also affect growth. Meaning that exchange rate is not the only independent variable, okay? Because if you just run a single regression with exchange rate on the right-hand side, then definitely you suffer from the model misspecification. And that is the reasons why modelers try to see what is the role of other factors that can contribute to growth. And one of that other factors is basically saving. The reasons why they use saving is because if the saving goes up, then there is a tendency that the current account or the trade deficit will reduce. Or if the initial point you already have the surplus, like trade surplus, then if the saving goes up, then your surplus tends to be widened. Now, at this point, you should be able to understand why that is so. If you recall our discussion last week about twin deficit. Now, if the saving goes up, that means one of the twin deficit, i.e. the fiscal deficit, will tend to go down, right? So if the one of the twin deficit goes down, then the other one also tends to go down. So that is the reasons why economists believe that if the saving goes up, then there is a tendency that the trade deficit will also narrow down, okay? Now, the next question is, of course, what does it mean for the exchange rate, okay? If the current account is still in deficit, then the tendency of the exchange rate will depreciate, it's still there. But now the current account deficit is getting narrower because of saving rate goes up, right? So what happened with the exchange rate? Will exchange rate continue to depreciate or not? Well, the answer is yes. The question is, how much is the depreciation of the exchange rate? And this is the reasons why economists introduced the concept of exchange rate deviation. Exchange rate deviation means how far is the exchange rate deviate from the fundamental value, okay? So let's think in a simple way this. Suppose the GDP goes up. So now I put the GDP on the right-hand side as an independent variable. Suppose the GDP goes up. Will the exchange rate appreciate or depreciate? Well, if you go back to the last week class, we know that if the GDP goes up, there is a tendency that the exchange rate will appreciate, will get stronger, okay? Look again your last week notes, okay? So if the GDP goes up, exchange rate will tend to get stronger. So if we start from that simple kind of relation, then you tend to say that, then the GDP growth had an impact on the exchange rate. However, from this equation that you're seeing now, it turns out that the saving is also significantly correlated with the exchange rate deviation. Again, let me repeat. Exchange rate deviation means the exchange rate level that deviates from the fundamental value. Okay? And you can see in this equation, it's not only positive, but highly significant. Okay? So that means you have to correct the earlier statement that GDP growth leads to exchange rate changes. You have to correct that by including the saving. Okay? Now, before I continue, let me share with you. In the past, most of the study that try to see the link between GDP growth and the exchange rate tends to be positive. And that is the reasons why in the past, people believe that if you want to strengthen your currency, then the economic growth has to be high. Okay? So, that was in the past. But because of the fact that apparently there's another variable that affects the real exchange rate, not just the growth, but also the saving, then what you need to do is to include saving and the GDP in your equation. And this is what they show actually. So if you look at this equation, there are two factors there, GDP and real exchange rate. But now, the main question is coming back to the earlier. Remember when we start the discussion today, I'm asking the question, what is the impact of the GDP on the exchange rate? And what is the impact of the exchange rate on the GDP, right? So if you look at this equation, basically, if you notice the coefficients for the real exchange rate here, the deviation of the real exchange rate on the per capita GDP growth is positive and significant, because if you see the triple stars there, that means it's significant, right? But once you include the saving in your equation here, okay, notice what happened with the coefficient there. It's not only getting smaller, but also getting less significant, okay? So if you look at this, by the way, this is standard deviation, okay? So all the numbers in the bracket is standard deviation. So you can see, for example, the degree of significance drop, okay, from 2.54 standard deviation to 1.16. Okay. So from this exercise, one can conclude that, well, actually, it is still questionable whether exchange rate will affect the GDP growth. Okay. Now, these two columns, the first two columns is for all countries in the sample. So now they break down into emerging economies. So if you're interested in countries like Indonesia, maybe we have to look at the emerging economies. So if you look at the emerging economies, why this is okay. When you look at the emerging economies, the story is very similar. Without the saving rate, the coefficient is significant, even though the degree of significance is smaller now because there's only one star there. But then when you include the saving rate, look what happened. It's not only dropped significantly, but also it becomes non-significant. Okay? So, coming back to the first initial question that we raised, does exchange rate affect growth? From this exercise, the answer is no, it does not, because there is no significant relation between the exchange rate and growth. By the way, this includes something like 166 countries, so essentially it's countries around the world basically. If you include the developed countries, the number is 182, but for emerging market is already covering 166 countries, which include Indonesia there. Okay? So again, the conclusion is that if economists ask the question, does exchange rate affect the GDP? If they are just basing on the very basic understanding about exchange rate depreciation leads to higher export and that leads to higher GDP, they are completely wrong, because it turns out that there are many other factors which contributes to the GDP growth rate. And in this exercise, that other factors is the saving rate. Okay, so let me repeat. The conclusion is that if someone asks, does exchange rate has significant effect on the GDP growth, the answer is not. Okay, so if the exchange rate does not have, by the way, why we are interested with the GDP growth, because this is macroeconomic class. So one of the major indicators in macroeconomics performance is about the GDP growth, right? But since it is not significant, then the next question we ask is that, okay, if exchange rate is not significant affecting the growth, one question we can ask is, does it matter the regime of the exchange rate? So, for example, does that conclusion that the exchange rate does not significantly affect the growth of GDP apply irrespective of the system of the exchange rate? What I mean by system is fixed exchange rate and floating exchange rate, or the intermediate models like managed floating, crawling peg, and things like that. So that is a legitimate question to ask. So does the exchange rate regime matter in affecting the growth? So that's the first question.